We're on Daf Mem Daled Amud Beis. Shetchilas Nisa Nefila. Beginning of the flight is a downfall. The downfall of an army begins with a disordered flight of a few soldiers. This being so, one who flees is deemed a rodef, and he endangers the lives of the army and indeed of all of Israel. In order to stop a pursuer, to stop a rodef, to be matzah l'nirdaf, it's mutter even to kill him, and therefore the guards are authorized to smite with iron axes those who flee. If flight causes a downfall, the Mishnah should have said Shetchilas Nefila Nisa. From the beginning of a downfall is flight. So the Gemara will amend the Mishnah accordingly. Shenemar Nos Yisrael Lifnei Plishtim V'gam Magefa Gdola Hoisa Ba'am. Israel fled before the Philistines, and there was a great slaughter amongst the people. So we see that because Israel fled, they suffered a downfall. Halanu Omer, later in the pasuk it says, and this is all in Shmuel Aleph, Vayanusu Anshe Yisrael Mipnei Plishtim Vayiplu Chalon. The men of Israel fled from before the Plishtim, and they fell slain. So this pasuk again demonstrates that flight leads to a downfall. Vamedvar Mamurim. When does this apply? That those who return in their homes, and those who do not move from their places. B'milchemes harashus, avol milchemes mitzvah, hakol yotzim, afilu chasan michadro, v'chala michupasa. Even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her chuppah, and likewise the others who are normally exempt, both those who return from the border and those who remain in their places, in the case of a war of mitzvah, their exemptions do not apply. This derived from the preface to the pasuk that teaches these exemptions. The pasuk begins, again in the parasha Dvarim Chaf, Ki seitzei l'milchama leivecha. And the term ki implies a choice. So it's a discretionary war, a milchemes reshus. Alternatively, the inference is drawn from the word teitzei, implies a war outside the borders of Eretz Yisrael, which is a discretionary war. The pasuk is written regarding those who return. Thus, this ruling represents yet another instance in which a pasuk concerning those who return is used to teach a law concerning even those who remain in their places. Now, even if there is a milchemes mitzvah, and if the milchama will be won without the participation of these individuals, nevertheless they remain obligated to fight. For the usual turim, the exemptions simply do not apply in a milchemes mitzvah. The Chazon Ish writes that even in a milchemes reshus, if Klal Yisrael is in danger of defeat, even those who are normally exempt must go out to battle. The battle exemptions do not override one's obligation to save lives and defend the people. However, the nation may not knowingly enter into a milchemes reshus that cannot be won without the participation of these individuals who are exempt from battle. Many of the commentaries wonder what is meant by and a bride from her chuppah. Women do not go to war. The Radvaz, Hilchos Malachim Perek Zayin, answers that the Mishnah simply means that since the bridegroom goes off to war, the bride must perforce leave her chuppah. The Mishnah is not saying that she must go to war. Alternatively, she does go to war, not to fight, but to supply food and water to the soldiers. Ayin Rashash. Some argue that this ruling should not apply to those who are in the category of frightened and faint of heart, for since their sins endanger others, they should not be permitted to fight. However, the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim Perek Zayin implies that even those in this category of frightened and faint of heart, Yorei Rach Levav, must participate in a war of mitzvah. The Meiri likewise implies the same. although the exemptions are suspended in a Milchemes Mitzvah, it is still necessary to appoint a Kohen Mashiach Milchama, for he must recite the verses of exhortation and encouragement. According to some Tanoim, there was only, one second, am I reading the right? The Mishnah that rules that in a war of mitzvah, the exemptions that are proclaimed by the Mashiach Milchama do not apply. And if we assume Milchemes Midjan was a Milchemes Mitzvah, was expressly commanded by Hashem, then there's no need to appoint a Kohen Mashiach Milchama. Why was Pinchas sent in as a Mashiach Milchama? And the Or Sameach explains, in again Perek Zayin Milchas Malachim, that even though the exemptions do not apply in a war of mitzvah, but nevertheless we need the Kohen Mashiach Milchama to recite the verses of exhortation and encouragement. Right at the beginning of the parasha, Shema Yisrael, let not your heart become faint, is Hashem your God who is fighting for you, etc., etc. Om Rabbi Yehuda, Vamed Dvarim Amurim Bil Milchamos Mitzvah, Al Milchames Chova Kol Yotzim. Okay, that we saw. Now, Ma'ika Ben Rabbi Yossi the Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Where's the machlokas here? We asked that question when we learned the Mishnah, and the Gemara answers Ika Beinayu Avera Derabanan. So according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, he's choser milchama even for a violation of a derabanan, whereas according to Rabbi Yossi, he does not. Rabbi Yossi Haglili does not distinguish between one avera or the other. The sinner must return. Rabbi Yossi, however, says that the sort of a sin that warrants return is the marriage of a Kohen Gadol to an almana or a Kohen Hedjo to a grusha. These are averos shel Torah, averos doraisa. Now, if Rabbi Yossi holds that one returns only for a transgression of a biblical law, why is one of the examples the marriage of a Kohen to a chalutza, which is only an Isa D'Rabbanan? And the Ritva explains that Rabbi Yossi distinguishes between D'Rabbanans and Doraisas when those D'Rabbanans are not supported at all by Scripture. Okay. Kiman Azla Hadesanya, who is the author of the following brisa? Soch bein tefillah tefillah. He interrupts between the tefillah shel yad and tefillah shel rosh, and he did not make a second bracha. Avera hi biyodo. The chozer aleh meorchem melchama kiman Rabbi Yossi Haglili. This is a violation of Isa D'Rabbanan. Man tana lahad tana Rabbanan shama kol kronos v'hirtia. He heard the sounds of trumpets and trembled. Agafas trisim v'hirtia, the clashing of shields, and he trembled. Tzictzu charavos umayim shosim lo al birkov. He saw the glitter of the swords, and urine ran down onto his knees. Choser kiman lema Rabbi Akiva v'lo Rabbi Yossi Haglili. It's Rabbi Akiva who says that frightened and faint of heart is someone who lacks courage. According to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, however, the pasuk discusses someone who's frightened of sin. And the Gemara rejects this. But in this case where he's frightened of battle, Afir Rabbi Yossi Haglili Moder, Rabbi Yossi Haglili only adds another category. But he agrees to the category of Rabbi Akiva, Mishum Dechsiv. The pasuk says explicitly, V'lo yimas es levav echov kilvavo. He shouldn't melt the hearts of his brethren like his own heart. So this part of the pasuk certainly teaches us that if he's terrified of battle, he should be exempt and not influence the rest of the soldiers. So although Rabbi Yossi Haglili disagrees with Rabbi Akiva's understanding of Yarei Rach Levav, but he agrees that one who is frightened of battle is certainly exempt, and that's derived from the latter clause in the pasuk that says, "And let him not melt the hearts of his brethren like his heart." One who's afraid causes others to lose heart as well, and he must therefore return home. Lechem Mishnah disagrees. According to him, Rabbi Yossi Haglili doesn't agree that anyone who's frightened is exempt. Only in the case of extreme terror, he trembles visibly, he loses control of his bladder. That, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, issues an exemption. And the Lechem Mishnah argues that this is implicit in the Gemara's wording. It states, in this case, even Rabbi Yossi Haglili admits. It implies that in ordinary case of battle fright, he does not admit. The Mishnah says, that anyone who attempts to flee, the guard may sever his legs. For the beginning of flight is a downfall. And this suggests that the flight is caused by a downfall. Now, the Mishnah says for the beginning of the flight is a downfall. It should have said, the beginning of the downfall is the flight. So we have to amend the Mishnah, and it should say, the beginning of the downfall is the flight. The Mishnah says, etc. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Reshus d'Rabbanan, Zui mitzvah de Rabbi Yehuda. That which is considered a Milchemes Reshus is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a Milchemes mitzvah. And a mitzvah de Rabbanan, Zui chova de Rabbi Yehuda. And a war of a mitzvah is Rabbi Yehuda's war of obligation. So what does this mean? The Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda are in perfect agreement as to the sort of war that qualifies for the exemption from battle. The dispute does not concern exemption, it concerns an unrelated matter, namely, what sort of war can be described as a mitzvah? The war of the Rabbanan, which is called a Milchemes Reshus, a discretionary, is the same war that Rabbi Yehuda calls a Milchemes Mitzvah. The war that the Rabbanan call a Milchemes Mitzvah is the war that Rabbi Yehuda calls a Milchemes Chova. So it comes out like this. Regarding exemption, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan speak in perfect unison. Unanimously, they agree as to which wars allow for exemption and which require universal participation. They simply give them different names. So in what do they disagree? In the mitzvah status of one of the several types of war in which the exemption is allowed, which the Gemara is going to identify immediately. The Chachamim regard the prosecution of this war or the implementation of this war as reshus, as voluntary. And therefore they label it as Milchemes Reshus. Rabbi Yehuda regards that war as mandatory, and therefore he labels it a Milchemes Mitzvah. Here are the practical consequences of their dispute. If the war is a mitzvah, its participants are exempt from other mitzvahs, and according to the Talmudic principle of Osik Mitzvah Potem in a mitzvah, if the war is not a mitzvah, its participants remain subject and obligated to other mitzvahs. Now, what about the different terms each uses to identify a war of universal participation? The rabbis use the word mitzvah, Rabbi Yehuda used the word chova. Does this indicate some further area of disagreement? It does not. The terms chova and mitzvah are close in meaning. Both indicate obligation. They differ only in degree. Mitzvah signifies a lesser degree of obligation than chova. When the Rabbanan label a second war as mitzvah, they're concerned only to differentiate between a war in which exemption is allowed and one in which it is not allowed. The niceties of the various degrees of obligation do not concern them. Therefore, although the second war is in fact an obligatory law, chov, the Rabbanan did not trouble to call it by that. They identify it with the term that signifies the next level of obligation. That's one level up. That's mitzvah. When used in counterpoint, in contrast to a discretionary milchemes reshus, even the lesser term mitzvah signifies a full-fledged chov obligation. As Rabbi Yehudi refers to the first war as mitzvah to indicate that one engaged in it is exempt, he's part from other mitzvahs. To differentiate this between this war and one of universal participation, he identifies the latter with the term that signifies the next level of obligation, namely chova, which happens to be in accord with its true nature. So the Gemara says that where is the machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda? Amar Rava, milchamos Yoshua lichvosh divrei kol chova. There's no argument between Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda about Yoshua's wars. No one would hold that those are milchemes reshus, because these are the most advanced degree of obligation, that of chova. And everybody would agree that one engaged in the war similar to that of Yoshua for kibush haaretz would be exempt from performing other mitzvahs. The Rabbanan referred to these as mitzvah because their sole concern was to differentiate between these wars and discretionary wars. Relative to a milchemes reshus, the word mitzvah signifies full-fledged obligation. Now, milchemes beis David l'rvacha, when David wants to expand the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, is the Re'akol Reshus. Everybody agrees that that's a discretionary war. And even Rabbi Yehuda would not call this a mitzvah, and one engaged in the war of this kind is subject to all other mitzvahs. And these are called wars that are fought for gain. That's called l'rvacha, for gain. So, for example, King David fought against the country of Aram Sova to annex it to Eretz Yisrael, or he fought against other neighboring countries to render them tributary and vassal states. Now, since the king sends them out to battle, there should be a mitzvah of obedience to the king, and they should be exempt from other mitzvahs. Okay, so that's a discussion in the Achronim. Key pligi. So where is the machlok between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan? Lim'ute ove kolcham d'lo-leisei alayu. A war that's fought to reduce the numbers of idolaters so they will not come upon Israel in war. This is what we call a preemptive battle. Mar karile mitzvah. Rabbi Yehuda jacks this up to the level of a mitzvah. Its purpose is to save Israel from their enemies, although it's not a full-fledged obligation, and therefore it does not require universal participation. Nevertheless, it's a mitzvah. Umar karile reshus, but the Rabbanan call it a milchemes reshus. And what is the nafkamina between Rabbi Yehuda calling it a milchemes mitzvah and the Rabbanan a milchemes reshus? Li osek b'mitzvah shepatim min ha-mitzvah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, when you're osek in this mitzvah of lemute ovi kol chavim, etc., you're patim in a mitzvah, and according to Rabbanan, you're not patim in a mitzvah. So it comes out that according to the Rabbanan, when they speak of a milchemes reshus, they are referring to a preemptive battle. The Rabbanan did not regard a war of this sort as a mitzvah. Rabbi Yehuda does. Both Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan agree that this is the sort of war where the exemptions do apply. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there are three categories of war. There's wars of obligation, chova, wars of mitzvah, and milchemes rishus. According to Rabbanan, there are only two categories: wars of obligation, which the Rabbanan call milchemes mitzvah, and discretionary wars, milchemes rishus. Kuliyamalo pligi, that the exemptions are suspended for wars of obligation, such as the milchemes Yoshua lekibush aretz, or milchemes Amalek, or the Zayin Amin, that's Yoshua. But in all other wars, the exemptions apply. So the dispute between the Rabban and Rabbi Yehuda is limited to a preemptive war. If, however, the enemy has already attacked, all agree that it is a war of obligation of chova, and the exemptions are suspended. Hadran alecha mashuach milchama. So we continue here on Daf Mem Daled Amud Beis and begin the 9th perek and the last perek of Masechet Sotah, that's Egla Arufa. And we're talking about a parsha in the Torah in Devarim Perek Chaf Aleph, when you find a murder victim, a banim, a corpse in a valley between two cities, etc., etc. And this is a continuation of what we learned in the previous Mishnah, because Egla Rufa B'Lashon Kodesh, there's Kenim who have to make a declaration of the Anu v'Amri Yedenu Lo Shavchas Adama Zevenenu Lo Ro, and the Kohanim respond by saying Kaper Li Amcha Yisrael Asher Padis Hashem Ve'al Titein Dam Noki B'Kerev Amcha Yisrael. These statements have to be recited in Lashon Kodesh and Emer Ki Motzei Cholol Ba'adam. The Mishnah says for the following: V'yotzuz Keinecha V'Shovtecha, Shlosha, 3 dayanim from the Bezdin Agol Shishalayim, from the Sanhedrin Agdol of 71 elders that sat in the Lishkas Hagozis, or Yotzim, and they come down to where they found the slain body, and they do a medida, and they measure the distance to try to find the closest city. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chamisha, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we have to send 5 dayanim from Sanhedrin, and 3 is not enough. Shenemar, how does Rabbi Yehuda derive the conclusion of the magic number 5? Skeinecha is Lashon Rabin, Shnayim. Shovtecha is Lashon Rabin, another Shnayim. And we have a principle of Ein Bezdin Shakel. We cannot have an even number on the Bezdin, because perhaps they'll be divided right down the middle, and there's no Hachra al Pirov. Therefore, Mosifan Aleim Od Echa, we need a 5th. And the kasha here is that Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan the beginning of the Ksuvim. He holds that the first time around we need it legufa, but the additional times, that's what we're going to darshan for a minyan. So the question is, how does he darshan the words Keinecha? And the answer is that Keinecha is not the beginning of the pasuk, but rather a Yetzu, and that's the word that is redundant. So the vav in the beginning of that word of Vayetzu is redundant, and Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan the vav leminyan. Okay, fine. Now we go on to the Mishnah Nimtza Tam, when they find the dead body covered begal shalvanim. It is buried under the debris of rocks, or toli ve'ilon, or he's hanging off a tree, or tzaf al pnei hamayim, or the dead body is floating on the water. Lahoyu orphan, there's no din of arifas egla, shenemar, and of course no din of medida, because the pasuk says ki motzei chol ba'adama, and the word ba'adama means that the dead body is laying on the ground, below tamun, and it's not concealed by the gal. The pasuk implies that the dead body was found on the land, lying exposed on the surface of the field and not within the land, buried underground or covered. The example given by the Mishnah of a pile of stones is merely an illustration. A corpse covered by anything else also does not obligate the din of Egla Rufa, as the Gemara will establish on Daf Memhe. Lo toli be'ilan, and so now, once we have the word ba'adama, now we heard nofel. And nofel means it's fallen as opposed to hanging from a tree. Because if it's hanging from a tree, the corpse is not in a fallen position. And once again, the hanging from a tree is only an illustration. Any corpse not found in a lying position would not generate the din of Egla Rufa. Basada, in the field, below tzaf al pnei hamayim. Water is occasionally considered a form of ground in regard to certain matters. But it's definitely not considered a field. And this exclusion includes any case where the corpse was not found in direct contact with the ground. So the earlier case given by the Mishnah of a corpse covered by a pile of stones is referring to a corpse lying on the ground underneath the pile. And similarly, the case of the corpse found hanging from a tree refers to a case where the feet of the corpse were touching the ground, not dangling in the air. Therefore, these cases cannot be excluded on the basis of the Adama, of the fact that the corpse is not in contact with the ground. And therefore, we need, in addition to Badama, the special mi'utim of Nofel and Basad. Nimtza Samach L'Sfar, if they found the dead body close to the border of Eretz Yisrael, with no town lying between it and the border, then Ein Modedin. O Le'ir She'ein Ba Bezdin, where they found the dead body in a town which has no Bezdin, within the borders of Eretz Yisrael, even if there are Jewish towns on the other side of the corpse, but if there's no court of 23 ordained judges in the town, then the halacha is a modin ale'ir she'yesh ba bezdin. So this exclusion is a town that lacks a court at the time that the corpse was found, even if later, subsequently, they appointed a court. It did not contain a court at the time that the corpse was found. So the Mishnah has three exclusions in which the pasuk, they would not decapitate a calf. The law in the case of a town lacking a court is different from the cases of a corpse found near the border or near a town where the inhabitants are idolaters. Whereas in those cases, no Egla Rufa is brought at all. In the case of an Egla Rufa, in this case, so we're talking about a case of an Ir She'ein Ba Bezdin, an Egla a roof is brought by the closest town that has a bezdin. Okay, we'll get to this in the Gemara. My Kalmar. Like the Mishnah stated that the declaration is made as part of the right of Egla Rufos. He said it in Lashon Kodesh. How is this law derived from the pasuk? Omre avo hachi kamar shenemar v'onu v'amru ulahalanu omer v'onu alavim v'amru. So this is the brachos and the clause pronounced by the Levim and Har Grizim Har Ephel. Mo'aniya hamura lahal b'lashon kodesh in the case of Har Grizim and Har Ephel. The Seder Egla Rufa Ketzad. Okay, we want to go through the procedure of Egla Rufa. Imotze chol badom v'yatzus keinecha v'shovtecha shlosha mibezna gadol shebYerushalayim yotzim and Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chamisha. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa. V'yatzus keinecha v'shovtecha keinecha shnayim v'shovtecha shnayim ve'in bezna shakol is Mosifin Aleim Echad Harikan Chamisha Divrei Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon Omer Skeinecha Shnayim, and he doesn't darshan the word Shovtecha v'Ein Bezin Shakol. Therefore, Mosif Aleim Od Echad Harikan Shlosha. For Rabbi Shimon Nami Yaksiv Shovtecha. So, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the pasuk Shovtecha? And the Gemara answers that Ikas of Rachmana Zikne, Havamina Filu Zikne, Hahumi Baile Lemiuchadim Shebeshovtecha. Okay, then this is where we'll stop and believe there. Where do we pick this up? Let me see. I'm not. Rabbanon Tisamim Heimed Aleph Shichachas Kama Minolahu. Adaf Mem Heimed Aleph.